Friends, happy Friday. Glad to have our friends with us again for almost weekly. I've been traveling a little bit, so may have missed one or two, but we'll try heading off on vacation shortly, so might even miss one or two more. You deserve a break. But our team gets no break because it's incredibly busy right now in the land of data protection and privacy, and it is busier than ever on kids and youth issues. Folks in the data protection community have been dealing with a fire hose of US laws, European laws, laws across Africa, Asia Pacific's on the move. I'm heading to South America next week, and many of the countries there were early, others more recent. Brazil, just having built out their significant data protection environment, and other countries they're still on the move. So it's just been a fire hose, and it has been busier on kids and youth perhaps than it has been before, with age-appropriate design codes, with age verification, with COPPA requirements, with enforcement activity. Many years ago, when we thought about how to deal with concerns of youth online, it was stranger danger. It was predators who were going to reach into the computer or lure your child into a dangerous situation. It was child pornography creeps who somehow wanted pictures and could access your child. It was, were your kids going to reach porn sites, and how could we keep them from that sort of content? And more recently, those issues are still there. More recently, the concern is, are your kids getting radicalized by the algorithms that will throw them into dangerous content? Dangerous being in the eye of the beholder. Sometimes mature content that might expose them to broader ideas about sex. Sometimes it might be pornography. Sometimes it might be marketing and advertising. That's probably the newer trend, although that's the old trend, because in the end of the days, that's what COPPA really was about, despite often being treated as a kid safety mechanism. The early focus for one of the first significant children's privacy laws was how would marketers use the data they had about your children? Well, joining me to talk about some of the latest are two of the senior members of our youth education team work, Bailey Sanchez and Jim Siegel. I'm going to pull them into this conversation, but let me just introduce a huge work that they pulled out, and I'll have them explain why. Let's ask our team to pull up the Unpacking Age Assurance Technologies and Trade-offs. We are well known at FPF for these infographics, and the reason we like doing them is that they're not just charts, they're not just visual aids. We've often found that when you're dealing with some kind of complicated set of topics and people are arguing and debating, you gotta level set. What are we talking about first, right? We've done this around the identification, we've done this around location data, we've done this in a number of areas. And so let me go to Bailey and Jim. What were we trying to accomplish here with this sort of set of terms: age assurance, age verification, declaration, estimation? There are all these obligations that seem to be built into the law, but a lot of confusion about exactly what's required, what are the trade-offs, what's feasible, what's possible. Let's pull the infographic out of the way. It is available. Please print it out. Please note, friends, that you can put this in your next deck. We ask for attribution, but all of the work that we do, that we publish online, is licensed under the attribution. Use it as you please for non-commercial use. Just give us some credit, because the team did a lot of work. We'd like to at least get some acknowledgement for that. But please do use it in your presentations. And Bailey, Jim, what were we achieving here with this document, and why now?
Sure. So thanks for that framing. You're very correct, Jules, that kids' privacy has been very busy, particularly in the last year or so. And with any kids' privacy bill, there's always going to be that question of like, how do you know it's a child, and also how do you know it's an adult if it's that type of bill where you're trying to restrict access. So with this infographic, we wanted to kind of first do a level set of the terminology. There was a lot of different terminology swirling around, like you mentioned, age assurance, declaration, estimation, verification. And so we thought it was good for everyone to be on the same page with that terminology. And then we also wanted to really understand, why are companies proactively engaging in age assurance technologies? Like what are the goals that they're trying to solve, and also what are policymakers hoping will get fixed by requiring companies to do age assurance? And so that's what the left side is. It really looks at like what are the goals of the age assurance? Like why are you deploying this tool? And then our middle part really like unpacks the different technologies and the different ways of doing that with varying levels of like privacy and level of assurance, or how well do you know that it is the person you think it is? And then the right side looks at like really the policy considerations of age assurance as a tool in the toolbox. Because you're trying to solve for specific goals and you're trying to mitigate harms, but often when you're deploying age assurance, you are introducing new harms. So I think it was important for us to kind of like point those out as well. And then we kept saying in this infographic, and we kept hearing that like there's no one size fits all. It's very contextual. There's a lot of it depends. But we thought it was really helpful to have a use case. So the bottom of our infographic kind of puts you from the perspective of a user and really walks through like how you might experience like age assurance. So that's really an overview. Jim, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, thanks for that overview, Bailey. I mean, I think really the goal was to kind of present that umbrella term of age assurance and then unpack it. But I think when I look at this infographic, really where I start is on that left-hand side in what are the goals. And I think this is really where we're seeing a lot of question and conversation with the various laws that have come up in the last year or so, and just really identifying what are the goals when you're looking to do age assurance from a policy side or from an application developer side. And the ones that we were seeing a lot were kind of that traditional piece that Jules mentioned earlier, kind of stemming from COPPA, that facilitating parental consent, but also what we're seeing in terms of either laws that are restricting access to certain services for minors, or putting them in age bands, like what we're seeing in age-appropriate design.
So, for years, companies argued, we don't really have good methods. It's the credit card, which is still in many ways the most widespread, or the click to say you're 18, you can now come and read about my beer, website. We all look at that and we're like, right. And we know the credit card option has been one that parents aren't in love with. They're not sure why they got to give their credit card to some third party. The credit card companies tell us this is actually a reliable method because we issue these cards to people under 18 sometimes. But in the end, that ends up being the default, and the technology hasn't apparently progressed, except there are a whole bunch of companies that now offer face estimation, maybe running into some of the new laws against biometrics. But on the other hand, now people are leaning harder on some of these new methods, analyzing your social media graph. The general concern that maybe some of these laws cover all websites that kids and teens are likely to get to, which means that I might have to authenticate myself at every site I go to, which has obviously led to some legal challenges. It still feels like all the stakeholders are sort of bumping heads, and that the progress, has been fairly limited. And whenever you do see a company roll out some greater request for information, you see this backlash from parents saying, why are they now asking for more data, about me? And meanwhile, the kids seem to get into where they want to, get in one way or another. So what do you expect? I mean, some of these laws are already in place in Europe, and companies have taken some compliance steps. Is there anything we can learn from where the UK, where some of the other jurisdictions have had to deal with these youth-oriented design codes? Do we see major changes there that are shaping what we should be looking to in the US?
Yeah, I can start a bit on like the policy side, and then I think Jim can talk about some of the like technology innovations happening in Europe. So I think on the policy side, we have noticed that what is coming out of Europe is a bit more flexible. Like under the age appropriate design code in the UK and in California, it's age estimation proportionate to the risk of harm. So, you know, there might be some very high risk use cases, and I believe France is doing this as well. Like to access an adult service, you might want to have like hard age verification, like knowing with exact certainty if someone is 19 versus 17. Whereas with social media, you might want to like have a general sense of how old they are and place them into an age band, like Jim mentioned, but you don't need to like do too much investigating to figure out, are they 14 or are they 15? And so that's the approach that we've seen in Europe. That's the approach that California takes with the age appropriate design code. But then, you know, a lot of social media laws passed this year, and a lot of like adult service website restrictions passed, like in Virginia, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Utah. And those pretty explicitly say age verification. So it doesn't leave as much room for that like technology innovation, like using a facial characterization method, because that is a form of like age estimation and not necessarily age verification.
Let me hold you on the risk of harm question for a second, because obviously in the UK or in Europe, the risk of harm, the reference there, I think often is to the UN rights of the child and so on and so forth, right? There's a reference point for what is harm to children, as I understand. And it's not clear to me in California, which is modeled on the UK framework, what that risk of harm is. Every day I read that social media is, you know, the most harmful thing to children. And then I read another study by academics who looked at every actual study, and it says, well, actually, it's not so clear whether the mental health crisis is because of all the disasters happening in this world, and whether for some kids, social media, you know, is a lifesaver, right? We saw it during the whole COVID shutdown, obviously terrible for lots of kids, critical for others who were able to have a learning experience without bullying or without, you know, other issues. And so it ends up being super complicated. And if I ask companies who provide a product, they don't think their product is risking harm. They think it's, you know, solving the world's problems, AI for good, right? And other people are telling me that AI is, you know, going to lead to extinction, and that the Italian regulator told us that we need to keep generative AI away from kids, and ChatGPT was blocked until they put up some click to approve that you're a certain age. So risk of harm,
Yeah, I think that's a great call out, Jules. I think when you say age estimation proportionate to risk of harm, that sounds like a very appealing idea, but really the devil is in the details, and harm is the phrase used within California age appropriate design code is like material detriment of harm, and material detriment of harm is not defined within California. There's a working group that will be starting soon that I think is going to help define that. But as of now, a company knows that they have some different technologies to play with, but the trouble is finding out what's proportional, because like you said, like a social media company might not find that their product is harmful, but perhaps a California regulator would. And similarly, like a news website, there might be certain jurisdictions that think that reading certain types of content is harmful, because the California age appropriate design code is not just looking at like the data protection practices, but it's looking at like, you know, how likely is a child going to be addicted to the service, or depressed, or like it's a lot more all encompassing. And so I think that's correct to call out that like it's hard to actually operationalize at this point, like what that proportionality looks like.
Jim, your thoughts? Jim, your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think that proportionality is where we're seeing this play out in the technology as well. So we talked about kind of that age gating that we saw with COPPA, and a lot of the bills referencing verification, so tying to a hard identity. And what we're seeing, those have been technologies and methods that have been established for quite some time. COPPA added the government ID compared and matched to a selfie was added in 2015. And not much has changed on the COPPA VPC, verifiable parental consent side, since then. But I think what we've seen in the last couple of years has been what we added in that middle area in the infographic, estimation, basically making an inference. Usually the most common one that we see is face characterization. So taking a live photo and making an estimation of somebody's age based on that scan. And I think one of the things that allows for is it allows for that age range rather than a specific age, which is useful in a lot of circumstances. But in some ways, it can be, when it's done well, be more privacy preserving than getting a copy of a government ID. So I think that's something that we've seen a number of times as we looked at this, was that middle area of estimation. And I think for me, what that really brings up is it has an affordance for anonymity that verification doesn't necessarily have. So if you're doing verification, you're tying it to an identity. And I think that has an impact on anonymity online.
Wow. Many years ago, when I was the Consumer Affairs Commissioner for the city of New York, we enforced the laws against selling tobacco to minors. And our inspectors had to recruit. I mean, how do you penalize somebody? You can't hang around lurking, and then you see some kid buy cigarettes at a vendor, and then like run in there, grab the kid. So we had to recruit minors, pay them, and we'd send them out to buy cigarettes. The merchants didn't like this. They figured we were like entrapping them. Maybe we were, but they were selling kids. They're selling tobacco. One day, I get a call from one of our inspectors in the field. I'm at the New York City Board of Education headquarters, and our minor just bought cigarettes. I'm like, wow, call the media. This is going to be huge. I'm going to hold a press conference. No, let's give it to the New York Post. They'll run some great headline about New York Board of Education selling tobacco to kids. The reporter is so excited. He runs down there. He calls me from the field and he says, Commissioner, thanks for the tip. He says, the Board of Education has a program where they give their vending coffee shop, tobacco, the gum, newspaper sort of stands to disabled vets. So the stand that your kid, and by the way, have you seen your kid? He's bigger than me. I'm like, well, I don't know. We hire kids that are 14, 15. Well, this 14, 15-year-old was evidently pretty big. And the vendor, he's a disabled veteran. He's blind. So you guys sent this big kid who looked like an adult to me to buy tobacco from a blind vendor. You think there's a story here, or is your agency overreaching? Now, of course, just because you're blind doesn't mean you can sell tobacco to a kid. But I'm like, what do you mean? I call up my inspector. Why are you going after a blind vendor? He says, blind? He wasn't blind. He looked at the ID. I'm like, oh, he's probably legally blind. I'm like, forget about it. Could we withdraw? And the point of the painful, embarrassing story, because the Post did write a little story, except instead of attacking the Board of Ed, they made fun of our, department for our silliness. Obviously, some kids aren't going to get access to content and materials that may be necessary because they look too young, they look too old. Obviously, some of these technologies argue that they're accurate, but at the end of the day, it's an estimate. I guess the critics would say, well, this isn't about access to content. It's about putting a more privacy default experience for those users. But I guess it does also perhaps mean that I'm not going to access LGBTQ content or some content that a particular state attorney general thinks is risky for minors. Does this end up intersecting with what the cultural battles that are going on today? I think we're all aware of all the debates over what kind of content, what kind of material different ages can have access to. Do we anticipate we'll see some attorney general, arguing that kids ought to be kept out? We see them wanting books kept off shelves. Do we see AGs or maybe companies having to be conservative about what they allow kids or teens to access because of these new laws?
So I think that story touches on a number of things that we tried to surface in the infographic. The idea of the impact of any kind of age assurance on teen autonomy, in terms of, how easy are these technologies to bypass when they are in place, that they can, that they can be a limiter on teen speech, that when you're pairing these up, you're looking for where the level of accuracy is appropriate, looking at that range, but then also thinking about all of these as a menu. It's not just one particular piece of technology, like estimation as the only method of age assurance. So, for example, in the scenario, in the use case that we at the bottom of the chart, is based around an online gaming example. And we kind of delve into the area where that estimation is very good for determining, am I, as someone in my 50s, am I over 18? Yes, that's a very easy question. It gets a little bit more challenging when you're looking at a narrow age range. If you're looking at someone is 14 to 18, and maybe there you need to have an alternative method of determining age there. I think that story also brings up one of the challenges where the technology is not there yet. I mean, you gave an example of a face-to-face interaction, which I think we're all very familiar with, checking a driver's license. And that's where a lot of the conversation is going lately, where there's a lot of interest for having something that works like a driver's license or works like something on my device to verify myself. And we're seeing this, and this is why we looked at kind of common methods that exist and methods that are emerging. Many states have adopted some type of mobile driver's license, but the way that the standards are right now, those mobile driver's licenses really are designed to work with face-to-face interactions like the example that you gave, rather than what we need in this scenario, which is doing remote age assurance over the internet. And I think the most common example that came up as we were looking at this was the example in Louisiana, where they started several years ago, back in 2018, to develop a mobile wallet for a variety of services, including providing an age assurance and joining an age attribute. And I think what we're seeing, and Bailey can dig into this a little bit more when we look at some of the states that have passed laws on this, is that infrastructure is relatively unique in what Louisiana built. Utah, Arkansas, and others don't have that infrastructure yet.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is that Louisiana passed their adult content restriction law last year. But as Jim mentioned, they have this really unique digital ID. And so this year, it seemed like some other states like Utah, Arkansas, and most recently Virginia kind of passed a similar copycat bill. But those states don't have that similar infrastructure to support that And so that's, I think, why we've seen the Pornhub has pulled out of those states and is kind of doing a call to action to say, hey, this needs to be done at the device level. It shouldn't be up to each platform to sort this out. So I think it's a really interesting conversation to watch. And then, of course, there's going to be First Amendment lawsuits that are popping up along with all of these bills.
The goal of these trusted identities in cyberspace type efforts has always been that somebody is able to have various verified information about you, but that somebody, an employer, the government, a school, might be able to simply leverage that they can assure that you are a certain age or that you are entitled to access, and that you, the relying party, don't learn any other information other than this user is able to walk in, right? Instead of showing my driver's license to show my age to get into a bar, and all the other information that's on there that it might not be cool to be sharing with, some random person. It just could have a 18 access. And it seems like those directions need to be the path that we need to explore more broadly. But what success, there really isn't that much yet, is there? There are all these new companies. Is there anybody in a position, if I'm a responsible company today, and I simply want to say to users, don't tell me stuff, but give me a chit that says you're of age, you're underage, you're a certain age, you've got parental approval, whatever the authorized token is. It seems like the CNIL wants something in that direction provided by third parties who would simply share the minimum amount of information needed, but not necessarily more identity information about each user. I know Prevo over the years has had sort of tools that enable pieces of this. What's the state of the availability of that sort of tool so that sites and services could rely on this?
I think it's very much emerging. So the example with the Louisiana wallet was really kind of a one-to-one. So a lot of these things are being built as one-offs in terms of the age assurance. But I think what we're seeing as a pilot project in Europe with the EU consent project is where I think we might see this going forward, is more of a federation. So this is really ultimately a digital identity and access management problem to some extent, as well as a policy problem. So in identity, there's this concept of a federated authentication. So the EU consent project is a group of several vendors that each of them are trusted and able to mint a token that asserts that a user is at or over a certain age, and one vendor will accept the token from other vendors in that trusted chain.
I guess the privacy advocates obviously see some of these things as quite concerning, because at the end of the day, it does force more of us to have, or to be forced to present a digital identity of sorts. The easiest way ends up being sometimes, well, do you have a digital driver's license or the like? And I guess if your focus is just child safety or what content teens can get to, then you don't worry all that much about it, and you just say, well, the law will prevent you from using the data any more broadly. But we've certainly seen in other efforts to roll out identity globally serious concerns for how being forced to identify yourself. In the U.S., we don't have a national digital identity, even though perhaps de facto we do with all the electronic information we give out, for that very concern that if you don't want to be on the grid, you shouldn't have to be. If you're not interested in being in the system, and that's part of our historic understanding of tyranny. We certainly see how militaries around the world end up being able to use identity databases as a way of knowing, who, what, when, and where. And I guess in a time of freedom and safety, we don't think about it. But I think at a time when you see, government sometimes as a threat, or government agencies or enforcement as a threat, I think we can be sort of sympathetic to the fact that that is a risk. I was just taking a look in the background. It looks like 2.5 million or so. This was 2022. LA, Louisiana wallets have been created. What is the actual population of Louisiana?
I think when we last looked, it was about half the state.
All right. Well, that's pretty good, but that means that, and maybe the other half doesn't need it. They're maybe senior citizens, but a lot of senior citizens in Louisiana and elsewhere are the guardians for grandchildren of various sorts. And it certainly seems like in almost every community, there are going to be people who just don't have, well, I guess everyone has a cell phone, but not everyone has a cell phone at a young age in particular, or a smartphone that's going to be able to support it. There are religious communities where smartphones are not accepted because they don't want them being used. So they're using non-smartphones, but they still may need to access a particular site or so forth. Anyway, what didn't we cover that we ought to mention? And if folks have questions in the audience, please do post. We'll take a peek. But anything we should mention before we sign off?
Yeah, I think the only thing I wanted to add on top of Jim's point and your point is that, like, Jim called out that this is a digital ID and like a technology problem, but it's also a policy problem. There's a lot to digital ID that's very much emerging, and there's ways to do it in a privacy preserving way. But I think it's also worthwhile to kind of step back and like ask ourselves, especially if you're a policymaker, what are we trying to solve with age assurance? Like, age assurance is a tool in the toolbox that companies have been deploying with or without regulation, but kind of like just thinking through like what is the goal that you're trying to solve for, and will knowing someone's age actually help you with that goal, or there perhaps other tools in the toolbox for protecting kids online?
If we're worried about the harms of targeted advertising, there might be more effective ways than somehow forcing everybody to discern age before using different advertising techniques. Right? Maybe that's overkill. While obviously we appreciate the concern of keeping younger people out of porn sites or other sites that might be violent or the like. Jim, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would just echo something that I had brought up earlier, which is just really focusing on the goal. And while the most obvious choice might be digital identity and verifying who somebody is, I think that for most cases, something like estimation, which is probably more privacy preserving, may be the best place to start. And I don't know, as Bailey mentioned, that the laws that we're seeing necessarily give that space for something that isn't just automatically jumping to verification.
Important point. Well, blockchain. Is blockchain a possible answer? All right, let Jim take this, but let me give my gut. If the point is somebody has a piece of information and stores it in a database, whether it's a blockchain or a central trusted kids provider, or some public representation, I'm not sure, other than the lack of a central player, does blockchain add anything here in particular?
It's certainly something that has come up. I mean, my take would be, what are the characteristics that we're looking for in a good privacy preserving age assurance system? And I think anonymity has to be a big piece of it. And I think level of trust, certainly blockchain could have a role in it. I think also I would add interoperability, so that you're not having to rely on building those one-to-one bridges when you're doing age assurance.
Interesting. All right. Well, thanks, folks. It's a Friday, so we're going to let you leave early or go back to work or do what you're doing on this steamy, at least weekend here in DC. Thank you, Bailey, and thank you, Jim, senior folks on our youth and ed work. Please do download a copy. If you come by our office, we'll give you a nice printed out one, and Bailey or Jim will even autograph it for you. We have a lot more to do in this issue. If you are interested in our work, please take a look at fpf.org, where you'll see lots of the research activity and developments that our team puts out, and our fabulous youth and teen team. Thanks for joining me on a Friday to talk a bit about the age assurance infographic. We will be sharing this more broadly. We hope it adds a little bit of clarity to some of the questions that are debated, so that we can have the discussion in a way that has us all at least on the same frame when it comes to the words and the technology. Happy Friday, everybody. Good to see you all.